Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Bryan McCann onto the show. Bryan, great to have you on.
Hi Dan, how you doing? Lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for coming onto the show. Honoured to host you. Why don't we start where we always start, by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience.
So my name's Dr. Bryan McCann. I'm a lecturer in psychology at Glasgow Caledonian University. I guess my main role there is to teach on our various undergraduate and postgraduate programs, particularly our professional doctorate in sport and exercise psychology. And my main role in that program is as placement coordinator for that program. So I get to do lots of exciting stuff with industry partners and trainees as part of that. Obviously, alongside that, supervising lots of trainees for placements and also for research. We're going to chat today about some of the research activity we're doing.
Indeed we are. And so at Glasgow Caledonian University, you must work closely with Dr. Paul McCarthy, who's been on the show a few times.
Yeah. Paul and I are good friends and colleagues. Paul supervised me for my BPS Stage 2. And also he was one of my supervisors for my PhD. So we go way back and work really closely on a lot of different projects and activities.
Delving a little bit into your past, if I may, Bryan, how come sports psychology, mate? What led you down this path? Was it were you a competitor yourself, or you just had a big interest in sports? Give me a little bit of detail to your sporting background.
Yeah, so I guess I was sharing this actually with some of my trainees the other day. This kind of how I ended up in sport and exercise psychology, but my sport myself was karate, and I was a national level athlete in that, and medaled a couple of times at national level, but was never really good enough to be top performer. But so that was my sport growing up. My father was my coach. I lived and breathed karate for years and years from about the age of 5, and I loved all sorts of other sports as well. I guess when I went to university, this is the bit that I was sharing with my trainees. I didn't really know what I wanted to do at university, so I went to go and see the careers advisor. Did a little questionnaire, and they said, social sciences, you should go and check them out. And I thought, yeah, I'll go and do that. Went to uni open days, kind of was intrigued by psychology, and then did my degree at Glasgow University for a couple of years. Unfortunately, didn't make it into their honours programme. I was too busy trying to enjoy being a student and not so much doing the actual studying, all the things I tell my students just now not to do. Then I transferred to Glasgow Caledonian University, actually. And my very first lecture was with one of my now colleagues, Dr. Elaine Duncan, and it was on sports psychology. And I don't know, it just clicked at that point. I suddenly knew exactly what I was going to do for the rest of my life was sport and exercise psychology. It just made sense. I've not looked back since. Ever since then, everything and it's all been about pursuing that career, to be honest.
I'm fascinated with the karate, Bryan. I'm going to try and not change the content of this episode because we're here to talk about your research on motivation. But I've got to ask you a few questions here, mate. You started karate at the age of 5, so some serious sort of long-term athletic development there, and yet you fell a little bit short. You sound like you achieved a lot, but you fell a little bit short of potentially where you might have wanted to go. Yet you started at 5. I mean, when you reflect back on that, tell me a little bit about that. What do you feel when you reflect back? What were you lacking? And what held you back a little bit, I suppose?
Yeah, so I guess there's quite a few interesting things in here. One is around the fact that you say I started at 5, and you talk about some of these long-term athlete developments, specializing versus sampling different sports, all that sort of stuff, and
diversification versus specialization.
Exactly, and I was all just purely 100% karate. Like, I mean, I did lots of sports at school, but because I started competing at quite a high level from around the age of 12, I just kind of focused specifically on karate. And I actually look back on a bit of regret. I got offered a trial with a local rugby club. And I went along, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and I was just really embarrassed by not knowing what I was doing, going from a situation where I know exactly what I'm doing as a high level karate athlete, and then going to a situation where I don't know what I'm doing. But they wanted me to stick in their academy, and I turned them down. And then I kind of look back and wish I'd maybe explored that a little bit further. Although at the time, when I was 12, I was the biggest in my class at school, but I haven't grown since then. So I think they might have been disappointed that I was a really big, well-built 12-year-old that turned into a fairly short adult. But I guess the things that maybe held me back from where I wanted to get, I suppose karate, particularly in the kind of context that I was competing in, I didn't have any sports science support. I didn't have any psychological support. The setup for even the national squad was just not really very professional. And I guess it's interesting because I've now just placed one of my trainees with the Scottish national squad for karate, for the discipline that I was involved in. So that was quite a nice thing for me to go in and say, well, actually, I can go and help the athletes that are going through what I went through. Yeah. So I guess that's part of the reason I think that I maybe didn't quite achieve the level that I could have achieved, because I think I had a lot of the natural ability, but maybe not the support around me that might have taken me that a little bit further.
Well, can you unpack that just briefly when you reflect back from a psychological perspective, and given what you know now, when you think about your competing self through your teenage years? I mean, what would you tell your teenage self? What would you teach or try to help foster in your teenage self from a psych perspective?
I guess goal setting. I wish I'd been better at goal setting. I know that seems like bog standard, but I think as well, as you're going through your teenage years and there's so many competing demands on your time, and lots of other exciting things on the horizon, you maybe need to have a little bit more focus. So I wish I was a little bit more focused at that point, and goal setting would have helped with that. I guess as well, because I trained with my father as my coach, and we kind of I was also an instructor, so I was kind of split. I think I started teaching from the age of 14, and so from the age of 16, I was almost a part-time coach as well as a competitor, and I think splitting that just meant that I couldn't focus 100% on the goal of competing in it.
Yeah.
I guess I look back in retrospect and think, was that a bad thing? Because actually I loved coaching, so I don't regret coaching, but I think if I wanted, there's such a short window to be a successful competitor that maybe I could have thought, well, actually, I'll get into coaching a bit more and be a bit more serious about my coaching in the future rather than focus on that just now. So yeah, I think a little bit of goal setting, a little bit of perspective, and then in terms of my discipline within competitive karate was kata. So that's the forms. I don't know how much you know about karate, but so you have the kumite, which is the fighting, which is like if you watch the amazingly, and it was always a dream of mine to compete at the Olympics, and karate was actually at the Olympics this year, which was amazing to see on. It was actually really emotional to watch it on TV.
Oh, wow.
But if you watch that, you'll have seen there were two disciplines. There was the kumite, which is the sparring, fighting, non-contact, I should add, version, and my discipline was kata, which is the forms. That was mainly down to injury. I specialised in both when I was younger, and then I dislocated my shoulder in a bout and wasn't able to compete after that in the kumite. So that's kata was my kind of form, and it's quite it's very individual. So you go up, you do your, it's kind of like gymnastics routine. You go up and it's all about yourself. There's nothing you can do to influence your competitor. But I think one of the things I really struggled with was my emotions. If I was really, frustrated with how I performed, then that would have a knock-on effect to potentially the subsequent bout and performance. So I guess being able to control my emotions might have been quite helpful.
And so on that basis, my last question for you before we move on to what we're here to talk about, you say that you were challenged by your emotions. Now, as a sports psychologist, deeply embedded in the world of sports psychology from an academic, a theoretical, a practical standpoint, do you think your teenage self, from an emotional perspective, do you think you could have learned? Do you think you could have got enough shift intrapersonally, behaviourally, to be able to have whether just improved a little bit or actually have solved the emotional problem, the emotional challenge, and or actually have reached the level you aspired to if you had that help from an emotional standpoint?
Yeah, quite a bit to unpack there, so I'll try and keep it brief. I guess.
I tell you why I ask, because I reflect back on my golf career, and everything I know now, I still know it would have been an enormous challenge for me to get enough shift psychologically to have made it would have made a difference. How much shift I could have got, I don't know. So that's an area I'm fascinated with.
I think certainly having a better awareness of the influence of my emotions and what I could do to potentially influence them positively, and what I was potentially doing to negatively influence my emotions would have been helpful. Whether I could have been, I'm not convinced that would have necessarily made a difference, and maybe it's just the kind of negative side of myself. But I don't know that I was ever really good enough to get to, I think I probably could have competed at Scottish level, and if any of my Scottish competitors are listening, they might argue differently, but I think I could have basically the process was if you won the Scottish Championship, then you got to represent Scotland at international level, and I think I came close a couple of times, and I don't think I would have got anywhere internationally. I don't think I was good enough for that level, but I think I would have probably looked back on it with a little bit more, I guess, happiness that I'd given it the best shot that I could, if I was able to better control and be more aware of my emotions, and how that influenced my performance.
I always say that I would have had, I wouldn't necessarily have got into the top 500 in the world in golf by any stretch of your imagination, but I would have had more fun, and I would have won a little bit more money. That's for sure. But of course, Bryan, what we're supposed to be saying here is, clearly, if we had both been seeing a sports psychologist in our teenage years, you would have definitely made the Olympics. And I definitely would have been in the top few hundred in the world. I mean, because that's the difference sports psychology makes.
Well, yeah. I mean, on paper, maybe we advertise ourselves that way. But if any of my trainees are listening, they might take slight umbrage to that and think that totally contradicts a lot of what I tell them. I think sports psychology would have helped me, like you say, enjoy it a little bit more, and possibly helps me fulfill my potential. But I'm not convinced my potential was Olympic level potential. So, yeah.
Listen, let's crack on with what we're here to talk about today. So, as so often is the case, we follow each other on Twitter, and I came across on your timeline a paper that you'd written and released, and it's a paper on motivation. That I sort of got in contact with you and said, we got to talk about this. This looks awesome. The title of the paper is A Retrospective Investigation of the Perceived Influence of Coaches, Parents and Peers on Talented Football Players' Motivation During Development. And this is a paper written alongside, as you say, your good friend and colleague, Dr. Paul McCarthy, who's been on a Sports Psych show a few times, and he's from, like yourself, Glasgow Caledonian University. Kay Cooper and Katrina Forbes Mackay from Robert Gordon University, and a bit of a joint project with Richard Keegan in Australia at the University of Canberra. So that's the lowdown of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about motivation and the influence coaches, parents and peers have on players' motivation. So I think to get us started, Bryan, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the genesis of this paper?
So, yeah, the genesis of the paper, I guess it's probably worth highlighting that this was one of the papers, our studies I completed as part of my PhD. So I was previously at Robert Gordon University as a lecturer in sport and exercise science, and completed my PhD part-time alongside that lecturing role. So this was one of the studies from my PhD that I'm delighted I managed to get to the point of it being published. So a long road, not necessarily because of issues around publication, more just about issues around changing job and, prioritizing getting papers out. But the genesis of it really is, at the time when I was in my PhD, I did a lot of work with the Scottish Football Association, and was providing, as a trainee at the point, and then latterly as a qualified practitioner, I was coordinating some sports psychology support for the Scottish Football Association's Performance School programme. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that programme.
No, do you want to briefly take us through it?
Yeah, so the Performance School programme in Scotland, basically the Scottish Football Association, the SFA, they identified that a potential for improving the quality of players coming through and trying to look ahead into the future and how best to create, excellent first team footballers for the Scottish team. What they've done is, and I'm not sure, it must be getting towards 10 years this programme's been up and running. They worked with partner secondary schools across Scotland. I think there's 6 or 7 performance schools.
7, isn't there,
I think, yeah, you're right. And what they did was they basically they identify players that show potential. There's lots of different criteria for that, and they've embedded the performance school within the secondary school, so that a young person coming onto the performance school basically substitutes one of their normal subjects that they would study over the 6 years in secondary school in Scotland with football, led by a high quality, really excellently qualified coach. And so basically I think it's to add 10 hours of almost bespoke one-to-one football development per week across the 6 years that a young person could be involved in the performance programme. And they've had quite a bit of success. There's a significant number of young people coming through the performance school programme that have gone on to play for first team teams in Scotland, and I'm not sure if any of them have played for the national team in the men's team. I think there might be a couple that have played for the national team already in the women's team. So it's been a while since I've engaged and been involved in the programme, so apologies to the performance school if I'm getting some of the current information a little bit wrong, but I think it's a great programme, and when I spoke to their national performance director for the programme about the opportunity for sports psychology support, they had sports science support embedded in the programme, but what we did was there were a number of trainees, not as many as there are now across Scotland, and so we came up with a model where the trainee sport and exercise psychologist would go in and offer workshops to the players, and I would supplement that with workshops to the coaches as well. So we ran that for a couple of years, and that was really effective, and through that relationship we got access to some of these high performance young athletes, and that kind of my interest was around motivation, and in particular you mentioned Richard Keegan as one of our co-authors on this paper, and his work around the motivation kind of spurred me on to look at how I could do some research in this space. So that's where the opportunity came. I had access and involvement with young high performance football players, and was interested in motivation. So I came across this, or developed this idea, this research idea. I guess particularly around there's lots of research, as we know, about the influence of coaches, the influence of parents, the influence of peers, the influence of other social agents, we refer to them as in this paper, on athlete development, on athlete motivation. There's a number of papers and bits of research that have looked at 2 or 3 of those social agents at the same time. Richard's research had looked at all 3 at the same time, but what hadn't been done was, so Richard's series of studies looked at athletes in the sampling stage, and then the specialising stage, and then the investment stage, but not the same athletes. And so what I was keen to do was to say, well, if we look at the entirety of a young athlete's, an athlete who's in the investment stage's career, and retrospectively look at that, can we understand the complex social influence of those social agents on their motivation over time, and how that might have changed over time? That's a really, you'll find, Dan, you might regret asking me onto this show because I give very long-winded answers to very simple questions.
No, it's perfect. No. You're the ideal guest on this show because it means that I can just sit back and listen to your informed viewpoint and opinion. What I'm hearing you say is you really wanted to study the perceived motivational influence of certain what you might describe as social
Yeah.
agents on athletes. Those social agents being coaches, parents and peers. So you wanted to find out the motivational influence coaches, parents and peers had on their athletes, and not just individually, which so much research looks at, what influence do parents have motivationally on an athlete? What influence do coaches have motivationally on an athlete? You wanted to find out the simultaneous influence that these agents have. Now, you mentioned stages there. So, was the research studying the influence, the motivational influence over different stages that these athletes were in their development?
Yeah, so what we used was Cote's athlete development model, and
Jean Cote.
yeah,
Jean
yeah,
Cote,
Jean Cote,
yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
And so that model breaks down the stages of athlete development into three stages. So it's the developmental model of sport participation, and basically what it suggests is that athletes go through a sampling stage and then a specializing stage and an investment stage. So sampling, they might, try lots of different sports out at that point, and they're participating mainly for fun and enjoyment. Specializing, they might identify a few sports that they enjoy and maybe start to get a little bit more serious, and maybe with an eye to competing, but I guess just trying to really develop their skills in those particular sports. And then investment, where they've focusing in on one sport and trying to achieve that to the highest level that they possibly can. And particularly athletes that become I guess high performance athletes in their sport tend to go down those stages to get to the investment stages.
Are those stages defined within a certain age group?
Yeah, there's a bit of flex obviously in the age groups, but I guess the specializing stage, sorry, the sampling stage tends to be maybe, I guess it just depends, but maybe between 7 and 11. Specializing stage anywhere from I guess 9 to adulthood.
Yes.
And then the investment stage tends to be kind of late teens into adulthood.
Right. Gotcha.
And so yeah, I was interested. Obviously, there's a lot of research done on these developmental models and the fact that people participate in sport not in isolation from the rest of their life, and so there's lots of transition points and lots. I guess it's a dynamic process, and so I was interested in. Well, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of merit in focusing in on the relationship that an athlete might have with their parents or coach or their peers. But I was really interested. I guess I'm quite interested in messy things, like trying to make sense of complex dynamic systems that are going on, and that was keen. I felt that there wasn't as much research that says, well, actually, just at that sampling stage, for example, there's lots of social influencers on an athlete's motivation, according to the literature. But how do they actually potentially at the same time influence the motivation? Are they all providing the same type of motivation or motivational behaviors? Is it slightly different? Or do each social agent have a particular role? And I guess what I've latterly, and we can talk about where the research has maybe taken me now, but at the time I was also thinking about both my parents worked in kind of social work and settings, and I just always intrigued by non-standard kind of progressions and context. So if parents, coaches, and peers have particular roles, what happens when you have a young person who's maybe lost a parent or lost their parents and is in care or things like that? So I guess I'm interested in that kind of complex context, and this was the first step to trying to make sense of the complexity.
Bryan, motivation is broad and perhaps deep. Is there a specific way in this research project that you're defining motivation? When you say you're studying the motivational influence on athletes as a consequence of coaches, parents, and peer relationship. How are you defining motivation here? Is there something specific there?
Yeah, so we used within the research, and I guess within my thesis, we used Hager and apologies, I'm terrible with pronouncing names. Chatsis Sarantis.
Right.
We used their definition from 2007. So motivation being an internal state that energizes and drives action or behavior and determines its direction and persistence. So I guess you're right there. I think there was I can't remember where I read it, but something like there's over 50 different definitions and theories of motivation. So trying to make sense of what that is and what that means. So I guess that was the kind of definition that we used. It is internal, but I guess all of our internal behaviors can be influenced by external things and external factors. So I guess as well, it's worth emphasizing that what we were interested here was about the perceived influence, because what does a young person or a young athlete, how did they perceive the influences that their social agents had on their motivation? Because we know from research that for example, in the same coaching session, you might have 10 athletes in that coaching session who all perceive the influence that the coach has on their motivation differently. But they're all receiving the same coaching in that space. So we were interested in the perceived influence that the athletes had, as opposed to maybe any kind of objective, and particularly because we were looking retrospectively over a long period of our participants' careers in football. It was important to look at their perceptions.
Those perceptions are so individual specific, aren't they? The amount of times they're working in a medical department and listening to the players come in after training, and one player will go, "I loved that training session. That was awesome. I feel so good now." Another player will sort of say, "Oh, I hated that. That was rubbish." And you think, wow, what a disparity. Same training session, same coaches, same voices. I suppose same experience, but experience is phenomenological, isn't it? It's so personal to athletes. How did you go about conducting this research? So you're trying to ascertain a perceived motivational influence that athletes have from their coaches, parents, and peers. So did you just go out there and interview these footballers, these soccer players? Take me through the procedure.
I mean, the research was done a few years ago, and ironically, pre-pandemic, I did phone interviews. I wish that Teams and Zooms were more common then, because it would have been nice to have done them via and actually being able to see the participants. But yeah, based on our geographical distance and my lack of funding for transport, I conducted phone interviews with 4 investment stage players. So these were players who had signed professional contracts with professional football clubs. So I deemed them as being investment stage, and basically was asking, as part of the interview, was asking them, I explained the different stages of development, the sampling specialising in investment stages. I asked them to think about what was going on at each of those different stages, and to maybe give me an idea roughly what age they might themselves consider themselves to have been at those stages. And then I broke down the interview into each of those stages and asked them in a very general sense about, who was involved and maybe was involved in motivating them, and also gave them a definition of motivation, and then broke that down into each of the social agents that I was interested in. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, these aren't the only 3 social agents that might influence an athlete's motivation, but I felt as a first step it was important to look at the 3 probably most dominant motivational influences in a sporting context. Now, I mentioned about the fact that I was interested in the perceptions of these players, but I also interviewed one of each of their parents as well. And I guess the reason for that was I was asking the players were all around 18, and I was asking them to think back. Some of them talked about being in their sampling stage around the age of starting at the age of 3 or 4, and so I was asking them to think back about and give me examples of behaviours that their coaches, their parents, their peers were demonstrating at that point, and obviously their recall for when they were 3 or 4 was pretty sketchy at times, and so that's why I involved the parents as well to try and draw out some of those kind of concrete examples from the development as well, and so so I interviewed one parent for each of the players as well.
And so were these interviews with players was it sort of semi-structured? Was it completely structured?
Yes.
Obviously, you've described how you would define motivation for them. You would define different stages. But was there a set list of questions?
Yeah, it was semi-structured in nature. There were key topics that I was keen to kind of cover with each of the participants. What I found though when I was doing the interviews was the interviews went a lot longer than I'd anticipated at times because they had a lot to say, and
Okay.
I guess the great thing about semi-structured interviews is you get to explore things that come up and explore the perceptions that the players have and get to prioritize their voices a little bit as well. So.
And so you gathered the data in the form of qualitative information, and I assume you then went through a process of sort of categorizing this qualitative data.
Yeah, I did what's known as an abductive data analysis.
Abductive data.
Abductive,
Right.
yeah. I'm not going to get. I will invite listeners to go into a little bit of research by reading my paper, obviously. As to what that actually means. But yeah, I guess we were trying to take Richard Keegan calls it a theoretically agnostic perspective. So I wasn't wanting to be. I was informed by existing theories of motivation, but didn't want to be guided by them in my analysis.
Right.
It's a really deep, long conversation about the whys of that, and it's all covered in the paper around not. There are dominant theories of motivation in sport that I think often researchers and practitioners as well use in a very uncritical way, and as a result I was keen to see whether there was it's not quite a grounded theory, but a theory specific to this particular context in these players. So yeah, the abductive approach, basically, I can talk you through it, but I transcribed the interviews and I familiarised myself with them. I talked to my trainees and students about familiarisation. I would play the recordings over and over whilst I was at the gym or out for a run and things like that. That's how I like to familiarise myself with the words that the participants of the research I'm involved in use. And then I did an abductive analysis, which is inductive followed by deductive analysis. And I guess we identified a number of codes that were relevant to and themes that kind of were then relevant to the kind of topic, and we broke those down into those that were relevant to coaches, parents, and peers, and came up with a number of I guess categories of social agent influence across development.
Would I be right in saying there are 5 categories?
Yeah, there were 5, and so those were, we categorised the findings into the aspects to do with relationships, so the factors to do with relationships, interpersonal interactions, support for development, support for participation, and then feedback and evaluation. And that's how we categorise.
And so let's unpack these. And before we do, I'm sure you'd back me up on this. This is important to unpack because it gives us insight. It gives coaches insight into the dynamic between social agents, as in coaches themselves, parents, and peers. That dynamic relationship between them and the athlete, and influences, I'm guessing, the engagement of the athlete, the development of the athlete, right through to the performances of the athlete. So unpacking these would be considered a pertinent thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, that is really the purpose of the research, is to get the findings and then to look at what does that actually mean in practice, and how can, like you say, in this context, most likely coaches be aware of the broader social influences on their athletes' motivation. But I guess parents as well would be interested. For me, I think one of the key findings or the key kind of takeaways from this is that if each social agent is better aware of the role of the other social agents as well, then and how they kind of complement each other and all influence the athlete's motivation, then it's only going to enhance awareness and understanding, and then improve the quality of support that each of the social agents provide to an athlete.
Well, just to say, Bryan, I mean, we had Dr. Jamie Taylor on a few weeks ago, and we were actually talking through that, basically that outside voices influence development within the talent development pathway. I think we took it down the avenue of critical thinking, that it's important to help the metacognition, the thinking about thinking, the thinking about learning of the participants in talent development pathways. So this can be paired quite nicely with the episode with Dr. Jamie Taylor. But it matters, doesn't it? It matters for coaches to have an understanding of the influences external to the athlete and how those agents influence motivation. So let's begin at the beginning here. Let's briefly unpack each category. So firstly, starting at relationship factors. At these three stages, the sampling stage, the specialization stage, the investment stage. I mean, over to you on this one. Talk to me a little bit about the relationship, what you found about the relationship factors.
Yeah, so participants, they talked quite a lot about how important the quality of relationships they had with their social agents. They perceived those to be motivationally relevant, and they were important for their motivation. So, for example, they talked about the friendships that they had, how close their relationships were with other people, and also is remembering that this is in the context of football, the kind of the group nature of the sport, and that kind of feeling like a part of a group, in the relationships that form as part of that group, in that sense of belonging. And I guess as well, there was this idea of having some role models within the team, and that was initially coaches were seen as role models, but then peers became role models as players progressed. And this sense of similarity as well was really important. So being motivated by other people that you perceive to be similar to yourselves, and also participants talked about that similarity in terms of, well, my coach is an ex-player, so they get what I'm going through, and the peers that are maybe a little bit ahead in the football academy, they've come through the process I've come through, so they get it, and as a result, I'm more likely to be motivated by them. And also the continuity of relationships. So I guess a lot of these players had played for a number of different clubs, had gone through a number of different academy pathways, and they valued the continuity of the relationships that they had. So the peers that they had gone through that process with, and gone through all those troubles and trials and difficulties and challenges with, tended to have a bigger influence on their motivation, as you would expect. So I guess the kind of key things as to how that developed over time that were interesting was that the relationship factors didn't really come in. Parents weren't mentioned a lot in this particular thing, which initially I was really surprised by, because you would think that the relationship that a player had with their parent would be really kind of central to pretty much all aspects of their life. But what we kind of dug a little bit deeper, we realized it was almost that this was kind of like it's taken for granted as a relationship. It wasn't one. It's such an everyday thing, the quality of your relationship with your parents, that it didn't even, it was implicit rather than explicit to the players as being of relevance within the football context. But what we found as well, that as the coach relationship was important throughout, but as I mentioned, that was kind of influenced by that continuity. So where players had coaches that they had worked with for a long time, they tended to be more motivated by them. Whereas what we found as well, that the role of peers became increasingly important as players progressed through the sampling and the specialising into the investment stage. Again, particularly those that there was that continuity, that they'd gone through the process together. I think especially the investment stage was interesting because prior to that stage, in the specialising stage, was quite often when the players were at academies and they're competing for places in that academy, and they're maybe seeing their peers as being competitors. So it was interesting to see actually they got a lot of motivation from their peers, even though they were potentially competing with each other for the kind of access to the resources and things like that. So that was the relationship factors. I don't know if you have any questions about those.
I have just some points to make. It would be good to get your viewpoint, because I'm probably doing exactly what you don't want me to do here, and I was starting to write down some theories, everything you said related to motivational theories, which obviously this is striving to produce its own theory of motivation. But as you were speaking there, you talked a lot about relationships and that word closeness, and thinking of the work of Professor Sophia Jarrett, who's been on Sports Psych Show, and closeness being one of her C's in her 3C+1 model. You talked a lot about relatedness, and obviously that can draw back to self-determination theory, and I know you do speak about that early in the paper. Role models is, I think, a really interesting one, and has a relationship here with self-efficacy theory, would you say? And I know self-efficacy theory isn't just a theory of self-belief, it's also a theory of motivation, in as much as if I believe in the skills that I have to accomplish a task or tasks, then I'm going to be more motivated. And specifically that notion of vicarious experience. When I see others doing it, then I believe I can do it. So what I love about this, I suppose, and I hope I'm saying the right thing to you here, but what you've drawn out of players does neatly relate to what some of the motivational theories are saying here. I think it's fascinating, Bryan. No question, mate, but just if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I guess this kind of comes back to the kind of aim for the research was to not be guided by a particular motivation. And I guess the risk when you're guided by specific motivation theories, and it's something that I kind of alluded to in the introduction in the paper, was that there could be a tendency to just look for things that agree with the theory, and maybe not so much focus on the things that maybe don't. So you're right. I think those aspects that relate to Sophia Jarrett's model, to self-determination theory, to self-efficacy theory, and I do touch on those in the discussion of the paper as well, are definitely there. But I think the key thing for me is that none of those theories fully capture what was going on in this particular area, and I guess that for me that was good to see, because if I'd only looked at it from a 3+1 C's model, I might have missed some of the other aspects when I'm considering the quality of relationships. And the same for the other theories. So yeah, I think that's helpful reflections, and it's good to see you and I are both on the same page in terms of identifying the theories that we felt were relevant to that kind of category that's coming out.
Well, also, Bryan, I mean, you alluded to being really interested in the complex and dynamic nature of sporting environments, and it just demonstrates, doesn't it, the multi-dimensional nature of motivation, that we can't bottle up motivation as just one thing. And apologies to all coaches out here, as we're going to slightly geek out on sports psychology, but as a whether it's a trainee sports psychologist or a sports psychologist fully qualified and in practice, we learn these theories, and we I suppose declare ourselves to be driven by theory, or guided and grounded in theory. And yet at the same time, when we get out there, Bryan, we realize, oh, hang on, wait a minute, this is actually quite complex, and actually there's not one theory that fits all, and actually that this is very dynamic, and actually lots of theories fit into this. So your work is an example of demonstrating that, and I think that's so important and so useful for us as practitioners, but also for coaches to get a real understanding of the dynamic nature of their environment.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the risks of theory is, I mean, theories and models are there to help us try and make sense of complexity, and try and not simplify the complexity, but try and capture complexity in such a way that we can make sense of it. But I guess the risk when it's interesting what you said there about being grounded in theory. I like to think of it as being theory informed.
Yes.
In the work that you do, because if you're grounded in the theory, then I think what happens, and again, I try and support my trainees to avoid this, is to think that the simplicity of how a theory explains a concept is replicated in, and you think things are simple. So there's another paper that you and I could talk about that I wrote a number of years ago when I came out of my master's and moved into my stage 2 for the BPS qualification. And I talk in this paper about my very first client was an Olympic level athlete, and I was so unprepared to work with an Olympic level athlete. They were coming with some complex things, which in retrospect needed me to work with them in terms of CBT or person centered. I needed to have more of a grounding in counselling type skills and things like that. Yeah. All I could offer with them was goal setting or self talk or imagery. And I guess we think sometimes we think, and if we're theory grounded, then we have that risk of thinking things are simpler than they actually are. And yeah, I was hoping to achieve that with this paper, was to actually identify and recognize that, like you say, it's multidimensional, it's dynamic, it's complex, and complexity is okay. And it's just how we try and make sense of that complexity without losing the complexity and losing sight of that complexity, I think is important.
Well, let's continue to crack on and make sense of that complexity. The second category is interpersonal interactions. Again, I know there will be a lot of crossover between these categories, so I appreciate you might feel like you're repeating yourself, but please do give us some idea of the findings here. Interpersonal interactions with relation to motivation.
So I think you're right. There again, it's that idea of complexity. So that
yes, of course,
the categories that we've identified, we've tried to make sense of that complexity. But like you say, there is certainly the boundaries between these categories are not, concrete as it were. So, but I guess this category was the participants talked a lot about specific behaviors, I guess, and the interactions that they had. So when it was relationship factors, it was more about the kind of quality of the relationship that they had, or they perceived that they had with a social agent, whereas these interpersonal interactions tended to be specific behaviors that they identified and recognized as having a motivational influence. So a lot of them were positive. The majority of them, there were supportive behaviors, which was perceived by the players as being, behaviors which helped or matched to the players' needs and goals. There were things that social agents did, which I've written here that they engendered positive feelings. But there was this idea that just the behaviors that made the players feel good about themselves and feel good about what they were doing. One of the quotes from the player, and I can't remember if it's in the paper, I'm pretty sure it is, was around magic moments. And I think it was in particular, it was actually to do with peers creating magic moments for players and just behaviours that kind of influenced that. There was also a sense of, and again this links to self-determination theory, this idea of promoting intrinsic motivation. So whether that was coaches creating that environment where players could have a sense of autonomy and get to choose what they were doing and feel intrinsically motivated, or if the parents or peers were influencing that. And interestingly as well, the players identified that there were at times explicit or implicit negative influences and negative behaviours demonstrated by coaches, parents or peers. And it was interesting, sometimes those they felt tended to help them be motivated at times, or it tended to have a negative influence on the motivation.
Depending on the perception they had of that behaviour or feedback.
Yeah, exactly, and also probably who it was that was providing it.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess there was an example where I think it was in the specialising stage, where one of the coaches tended to just not pick the player for any of the games and kept giving them quite negative, or kept giving them praise, but then not giving them time on the pitch and things like that, and they perceived that as being quite a negative thing, a negative behaviour. Not giving them the actual time to be on the pitch and demonstrating what they could do.
So from a coaching perspective here, those first two categories really are communicating, consider your relationships and consider your behaviours in and around the players. A broad brush summary there, but if I was a coach listening in, I would be maybe considering those two factors.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in particular around the behaviours, overwhelmingly the participants highlighted behaviours that made them feel good about themselves.
Yes.
And felt that they were being supported and felt that they were being allowed to be intrinsically motivated. I guess they didn't necessarily articulate it that way, but that's what came out, was this idea of they promoted that intrinsic motivation.
Category 3, support for development. Talk to us a little bit about this.
Yeah. So this category in particular, I guess there was a little bit, again, as you mentioned, a bit of overlap between some of the categories a little bit, and it was tricky to kind of, as it always is with qualitative research, to really try and do the data justice in terms of how you make sense of it. The support for development was around motivational support which contributed to their development as footballers. So they were really kind of aware of behaviours and influences that kept them motivated and driven towards their ambition to become professional footballers. And I guess we were interviewing individuals who at one point had a contract with a professional club, and this was the ambition for that young person for the majority of their development. And so there's aspects here, as you would expect, around technical development, psychological development, which is always music to my ears, and I'm sure you're the same. And there are things to do with facilitating development in relation to providing an environment which emphasize development. And so, for example, social agents, where they created an environment where it was okay to have a poor performance and it was okay to lose a match, but it was all seen as a developmental opportunity, as opposed to the outcome being really important. Well, actually, what did you learn from that experience? And think about how that learning helps you develop as a footballer, because no footballer wins every game. No footballer plays their best at every game. And also, they latterly started identifying behaviours that helped them prepare for performances as elite footballers, helping them develop those necessary competitive skills as well.
I think this is really interesting, because the way I'm deciphering that is this notion of the integration between the psychological side and the other components, maybe the tech, tac, and physical side. I mean, recently I had a conversation with a coach who is a very, very good coach and is highly regarded, maybe slightly guilty of being slightly old school with his thoughts around the psychological side. And I say that with respect, because that coach said to me, well, Dan, this psychology malarkey, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. This is just all about relationships, right? It's about having good relationships. That's what I value, and it's absolutely fantastic and great. And that coach has become a very good coach as a consequence of, or in part as a consequence of that philosophy. But there is potentially a missing piece there, and that's understanding that psychology offers so much more. And what I mean there is that motivation is heavily influenced by your capacity to teach the technical, tactical, and physical sides of the game. The psychological side is heavily influenced by your ability to create the right coaching practice with the right coaching processes inside of that practice that help players perceive that they're developing their game towards where they want to go. You can't really isolate the psychological side. It has to be integrated, or be seen to be integrated at all times. That's how I'm kind of interpreting this. Motivation is influenced by your capacity to introduce and teach all of the other aspects of coaching. I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent there, but that's kind of how I'm seeing that.
No, yeah, and you're not going off on a tangent at all. And I guess conversations like this are really, I think, are really powerful for us as researchers, because we get to look at. I don't often get to talk to people about the research in this way. So it's, you can go to conferences, you can stand up and present, but actually talking to someone about your research and then them coming back to you with their interpretation of what you're saying is really, I think, is really powerful. So I'd like to thank you for your insights along the way, as opposed to just listening to me, actually engaging and reflecting back at me. That's really helpful for me to better understand what we've been looking at here. But I agree. This idea, I guess it's also probably worth saying that whilst we have tried to categorize the motivational influences of these social agents, what we haven't done, and it's actually a subsequent study that we did that I'm currently in the process of writing up for publication, was to then try and look at, well, how do those categories fit together and fit alongside each other? Because, for example, this idea of, as you just mentioned, that motivation not just being in the way that you are, but being in what you do as well, in terms of your influence for motivation. Sorry, I'm summarizing and paraphrasing what you just said there. But, I think core to that is the relationship. In order to be able to potentially have, I'm theorizing here, but in order to be able to demonstrate the behaviors and for them to be perceived by your players as being motivational, then you've got to have a good quality relationship with them. And then as a result, they are maybe more likely to perceive the efforts that you're putting into training as being facilitated for their development. So I guess these categories in my head are not discrete and not in terms of they are interlinked with each other. And that goes back to the complexity, because it's quite difficult to then unpick and decide and figure out which align and which influence each other and what that influence looks like.
I love it, and actually, as we're going through this, again, broad brush statement, simplifying it perhaps when I shouldn't do, but sometimes it's useful to. If we're looking at the first three categories as relationship, behavior, and holistic development, that's what I wrote down. The first category for me defined as relationship, the second one behavior, the third one holistic development, if you like. I think with relationship, closeness really shone through. With behavior, helping players be intrinsically driven, and with this category, this holistic development, helping players be mastery oriented. So closeness, intrinsically driven, mastery oriented. That's again what's floating around in my mind right now, linking these and joining these together.
Yeah, that's a great summary, and maybe I should get you to help me write the next paper to be able to help summarize some of the thinking here, because you're doing an excellent job of it. So
no, I know where my average talents lie, and it's not in writing research papers. Let's move on to the next category: support for participation. We've got two more categories to get through.
Yeah.
Support for participation.
So I guess it might initially seem unclear how this differs from for support for development, but I guess this was the players talked a lot about how social agents just helped them not so much develop in football, but just be involved in football, and what that involved and what that encapsulated. So there were things like, particularly parents, providing practical support, logistical support, lifestyle support. Even when the players were in the investment stages, the parents were still potentially cooking for them, taking them to training, and helping them with other lifestyle type things. So that kind of practical support. I've seen other people refer to that as kind of logistical support, but also in addition to that, helping the players to continue to put in effort. So this idea of effort support and social support being really important. And also this idea of social agents acting as gatekeepers to participation. So I guess a lot of players kind of recognize the role of, say, their parents, and they let me, they supported me to become a footballer. They've sacrificed a lot, and they're giving me this opportunity. And the same with coaches. They're giving me this opportunity, particularly for a lot of coaches when they're unpaid, and they're volunteers. They're giving me time is the resource that they're giving me right now to help me achieve my goals. So whilst the previous category was, like you say, around this idea of mastery and helping them to develop their skills and develop into professional footballers, this, I guess, support for participation is almost that kind of broader context support. So how do they actually help me put in the effort I need to put in to be a professional footballer, to go to training multiple times a week, to still do all the rest of my stuff in my life, like school and homework and all that sort of stuff. How do they help me to do that? And that kind of comes across as being, keep me motivated. They kind of keep me wanting to put the effort in, helping me support with that effort, providing that social support, and just giving me opportunities.
I think so much of that is such the silent mediators of success, which is probably a term that is that I use far too often with lots of different things. But I wrote down there on the participation piece, and helping players manage their energy, or become better energy managers by building and managing their social support network. Brilliant. Love that. A final category: feedback and evaluation.
Yeah, and I guess this kind of links a little bit back to what we talked about around the support for development in terms of helping them have a development focus at all times. So basically, this category is all about helping the social agents helping the players to evaluate their experiences within football, and so this was around reflection and forward planning. They help them make sense of both the positive and negative experiences in their development, and what those experiences meant and how those experiences could help them in the future. So they did things like contextualizing so parents contextualizing feedback from coaches in relation to the long-term goals. I there was one player who got let go of one of the academies, and the parents, and I think as well the peers, helped them to make sense of that as being, well, maybe that's not the right academy for you, but you can still learn from that experience to still progress on to achieve your long-term goals as a professional, to become a professional footballer. So I've mentioned in the paper around this category being distinct but very closely related to that idea of support for development, that kind of category. And yeah, I guess as well, it kind of went beyond development in that the behaviours here allowed players to place their development, performances, relationships, and interactions with others within the broader context of their aspiration to become footballers, is what I've written in the paper. I think captures that kind of distinction from that other category.
I love that. Sense makers and critical thinkers.
Yeah, and critical friends, I guess. I mean, I use the friends word, not just talking about peer friends, but we use the term critical friends in research quite a lot. But I think that's a position that they take, just helping you make sense, and also maybe questioning your own thinking about your developmental experiences.
Implications for practice, and I say practice loosely because I appreciate that you're researching parental influence and also peer influence, so practice probably wouldn't be the term for them, but maybe it's implications for practice, for coaching practice, implications for parental behavior and how they might engage with their athletes. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think probably one of the key implications, I think, for me is the understanding, or I guess maybe step one, that social agents recognize. And when we talk about social agents, I guess the onus is probably a lot on coaches in this area, because it's their task to develop athletes in a way, but parents as well, I guess. But just basically, helping them be aware that the motivation is complex, and the influences on motivation are complex, I think would be a really good starting point, because like I said earlier, we can sometimes oversimplify things and then get stuck in that simplicity. But then also the next step for that is look at that complexity and maybe make sure that practitioners in sport, be it coaches, volunteers, parents, sports psychologists, consider ways to ensure that athletes are gaining the support from each of the social agents in line with each of the categories identified. I guess that's probably a slightly, obviously this is a qualitative study. We haven't looked to necessarily see these were perceived to be motivationally relevant and positive motivational experiences on the whole. And so, if nothing else, hopefully these categories can be used to help practitioners, to help coaches just make sense and map out what's going on for an athlete. What I'm keen, I guess, in future research is to see if there are, some of these categories might be more facilitative, other steps that coaches could take to enhance the motivational experience of their athletes, for instance, in line with some of these categories. So that's kind of the kind of next steps for research, I guess. Yeah, sorry, it's another long-winded way of answering that question.
No, it's fantastic, and for me, Bryan, I mean, my last comment here it is that I feel that there's some common themes that have come out of the qualitative data that I suppose you could say are replicated across multiple sports psychology research projects. It's basically players saying, when they're being positive about things, they're saying, well, these relationships here with my peers, these relationships here with my coaches, they were close. And that was good. That helped me feel motivated. These behaviors I experienced in these environments with my peers, coaches, and parents, they helped me be intrinsically driven. They wouldn't have used that term, but that was the term that could define what they were, what they were saying, what their feedback was. I also hear that players, athletes were positive around the development factor of being mastery oriented. I was motivated because I felt I was being developed correctly. I was mastery oriented, essentially. I had the right people around me to help me manage my energy. I had the social support, so that helped maintain my motivation. And then last but not least, I had the right people around me to help me feel motivated around I could make sense of things.
Yep.
I could make sense of things, so I felt more motivated. I could critically reflect on things, and that helped me. Okay, I feel motivated now. I feel motivated to go out there and practice because I can critically reflect on the things that are happening to me. And that last one's so important, isn't it? It's when players, I think, get confused and muddled, and clarity is lost, that they can lose motivation. And so the final thing for me here is, again, it just demonstrates the multi-dimensional nature of motivation and how everything we do as coaches and potentially as parents and potentially as peers influence that motivational piece. But it comes back to similar themes.
Are you sure you don't want to write a paper with me next time? Because you've got a knack for summarizing things amazingly and much more clearly than I have, I think. So but I think that summarizes it really well. It is. I mean, I started off this bit of research by saying that motivation is complex, it's multidimensional, and I guess also in the paper I kicked back a little bit at the kind of, from a research perspective, a slightly dominant approach of using particular theories as though they're catch-all theories in our research. And potentially, I know some practitioners, I was at a conference recently and someone described himself as a fan, basically a fan of self-determination theory, and I work in a self-determination theory way, and that kind of set off a couple of alarm bells ringing in my mind because for the reasons we've talked about, it's complex and the findings of the paper show that maybe self-determination theory doesn't quite capture everything and all the aspects of motivation within this context. So, and I guess I finished the paper by saying, yeah, it is really complex. And maybe this can be a starting point to try and unpick some of that complexity a little bit, and not, I think as well, I'm an advocate for complexity, and sport can be messy. Life is messy, and trying to simplify it sometimes maybe just does it a little bit of a disservice.
I suppose, in appreciating and respecting your time, and I want to close things shortly, but I just briefly dwelling on the thought of being an advocate of self-determination theory, and that a practitioner is entitled to practice in the manner in which they so desire, and self-determination theory is a very popular theory in psychology and sports psychology because it is very powerful. But I suppose, getting in amongst the weeds, it depends on what your relationship with self-determination theory is, because Desi and Ryan would say, well, there is still a place for that very, very extrinsic side of things. It's just not as good a quality of motivation. But clearly there are so many theories out there that describe different types of motivation in different types of contexts. And that's where we have to be very careful to make it contextually specific and also individually specific as well.
Yeah, I might not have worded my thoughts there clearly. I think you're right, though. It's about how do we engage with these theories in our practice, and I think the key thing for me is just always trying to be as critical as possible, and not just taking for granted that a theory is perfect, because no theory is perfect.
But I think you did word it fine, because I do think in sports psychology we have to be careful, don't we? Because we can be very guilty of pushing a certain theory or a certain philosophy, and coaches go, "Well, hang on a minute here. I've got a bunch of examples from my history as a coach whereby players didn't necessarily adhere to what you're saying and went on to be successful and enjoy being successful as well, and are very happy." So we need to be careful, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I think that's it. It's just being critical, being aware that, like I say, that not every theory is perfect, and there will always be examples that aren't explained by our theory, and that I guess the thing for me is that is an invitation then to improve the theory or create different theories, but I'm not convinced that that's always necessarily the case, that when people are using theory.
Well, Bryan, that's an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. And I know you would have tapped the interest of those listening in. So how can people get hold of you? Do you have social media? If so, what are your handles? How can people find you on social media? And if you want to be contacted, how can people contact you, maybe with relation to this paper?
Yeah, I'm on social media. I tend to be most engaged with Twitter. So my Twitter handle is at Dr. Bryan McCann, and it's Bryan with a Y, if you're wondering. So, and yeah, you can contact me at my email address, brian.mccann@gcu.ac.uk. I'd be more than happy to discuss this paper, the subsequent research that's happening as a result of it. And I should also mention that the paper that we've discussed today is published in the journal. It's in press at the Journal of Applied Sports Psychology, but it is also available open access, so anyone can access that free of charge without having to pay or have a subscription to the journal. So anyone can access that. Although I'd be more than happy to signpost that to people if they would like to get in touch.
Brilliant. Bryan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Dan. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.